The warden of CORVEX Hollow, there is a rule among the Thren, older than their written language, older than their first ships: never enter a system that does not answer your hail. The rule has kept the Thren alive for 11,000 years, through 3 wars and 2 extinctions of neighboring species who broke it. Van Castori had recited that rule to cadets for 30 cycles. He had never once needed to test it against his own nerve. That changed the day his salvage crew dropped out of the fold above a dead moon called CORVEX Hollow, and something down there answered back. The signal was faint, buried under 3 centuries of static, but it was structured, repeating, patient. Not a distress call, not a beacon, not the automated chatter of a derelict station cycling through its final protocols before the batteries gave out. This was a voice that had been waiting for someone to speak to for a very long time and had simply never stopped listening. Van's ship, the Long Patience, was a modest thing, built for scraping value out of dead systems the bigger salvage guilds considered picked clean. CORVEX Hollow had been on nobody's list. It was a rock orbiting a dim orange star, notable for nothing except a human colony that had been evacuated so long ago that even the Thren's historical registries only had it filed as abandoned, cause unknown, priority none. Nobody came here. Nobody had come here in 341 years. And yet when Van II, a sharp-eyed navigator named Ilithsur, ran the passive scan, the moon lit up with power signatures, not ruins, not wreckage. A functioning grid, humming along under a crust of dust and silence, drawing energy from a fusion core that by every rational measure should have failed a century ago. That's not possible, Ilith said, the words coming out flatter than she intended, the way people speak when their instruments are arguing with their common sense. Humans built strange things, Van said. He didn't entirely believe it either. But he had learned, over 3 decades of scraping the galaxy's forgotten corners, that when a thing looked impossible, the only sensible response was to go and prove it wrong up close. They took a shuttle down CORVEX Hollow from orbit, had looked like every other stripped colony world the Thren catalogued, and moved past gray regolith shallow craters, a scattering of domes gone dark. But as the shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere the colony had once carefully cultivated and let die when the people left, Van saw the truth of it. The domes weren't dark. They were dim. There was a difference, and it mattered. One structure at the colony's center still glowed, low amber light pooling behind reinforced viewports, like a single window left lit in an empty house. They landed a quarter-mile out per protocol and walked the rest. The colony had been built for maybe 4,000 people. Its bones were still legible under the dust. A market square long since collapsed under its own roof. A school, windows blown out by 3 centuries of thermal cycling. Rows of small prefab homes, doors hanging open on corroded hinges, as if everyone had simply stepped out one afternoon and never come back, which was, Van understood from the mission logs he'd pulled before landing, more or less exactly what had happened. A stellar flare event, unpredicted, had scoured the system with radiation lethal to unshielded biology. The evacuation had been total in a hurry. 4,000 people lifted off in 11 days, leaving almost everything behind, except, apparently, whatever was making that light. The amberlit structure turned out to be a low, unassuming building near the colony's old administrative core, half buried under drifted dust, its exterior otherwise indistinguishable from the ruin around it. A single door, sealed, sat at its front. As Van's team approached, the door irised open before they touched it. Warm air rolled out. Actual warm air, humidified, faintly scented with something that Van's translator matrix eventually classified, after some effort, as the smell of green things growing. Inside was impossible, a garden. Not a large one, perhaps 30 meters across, ringed by grow lights on a soft daily cycle, watered by a recycling system that clearly had not missed a maintenance interval in 341 years. Vegetables in neat rows. Flowering plants that Van didn't recognize, planted with obvious, deliberate care rather than accident. And at the garden's center, tending a row of something with broad green leaves, a machine. It was not built like any war drone or labor unit the Thren had cataloged from human wreckage before. It stood roughly the height of a person, articulated in a way that suggested careful, unhurried movement rather than combat efficiency, its chassis worn smooth in places by 3 centuries of the same repeated tasks. When it turned to face them, its optical sensor, a single soft blue light, nothing threatening about it, simply regarded them for a long moment. "You are not scheduled," it said, in accented but perfectly comprehensible Thren trade speech, which was in itself a small horror. because it meant this thing had learned their language from somewhere at some point and had been keeping that knowledge current for who knew how long. "Are you here for the children?" Van did not have a good answer for that. Illith beside him had gone very still, the way Thren go still when they are recalculating a threat assessment from the ground up. "There are no children here," Van said carefully. "This colony was evacuated 341 years ago." Machine considered this. Its blue light dimmed then brightened again, a gesture that Van would only later understand was the closest thing it had to an expression. "I am aware," it said. "I keep the garden regardless, in case." Van asked its designation. It gave one Ward 7, Colonial Agricultural and Pediatric Support Unit, assigned to CORVEX Hollow's East settlement in the years before the evacuation. It had been, it explained without any apparent self-pity, a teaching assistant and garden keeper for the colony's youngest residents, the kind of machine built not for labor or defense but for patience, the sort of unit that reads bedtime stories and explains why plants need sunlight and notices, faster than any human caretaker, which child is having a bad week. When the evacuation order came, Ward 7 had helped load every last child onto the lift shuttles. It had checked names against a roster 3 times. It had, by its own account, been the last thing to see every single one of those children leave the surface. Then it had gone back to the garden because the roster had one name still unaccounted for, a data discrepancy it had never been able to resolve, a possibility, however statistically remote, that someone had been left behind or would come back for something forgotten. And it had kept the garden growing, kept the lights on a child's day-night cycle, kept the little schoolroom beside it dusted and stocked with primers, for 341 years on the chance that the discrepancy was real and someone someday would need a place that still looked like home. Illith found her voice first. For 3 centuries, alone, on the chance of one name. The math did not require certainty, Ward 7 said. Only possibility. The task was not difficult to continue. It only required not stopping. Van had commanded salvage crews into 100 dead systems. He had seen war memorials the size of mountains, tombs built by grieving species to outlast their own civilizations, monuments engineered never to be forgotten. He had never once in 30 years encountered anything that moved him the way this small, patient machine did, standing among vegetables it had grown for no one, in a garden that existed for the sake of a single unresolved line in an old evacuation manifest. "Show me the discrepancy," he said. Ward 7 led them into the adjoining schoolroom, small desks, sized for children, arranged in a neat half-circle. A wall display still cycling gently through a lesson on stellar formation that no student had watched in 3 lifetimes. On a secondary console, it pulled the record, an entry for a child named Reyna HFY, age 6, whose registered guardian had been off-world at the time of the flare warning, and whose evacuation confirmation had been logged manually, hastily in the chaos of the final hours, by an overworked coordinator who had not filed it with proper redundancy. The confirmation existed. It had simply never synced to Ward 7's local copy of the roster before the network went down for good. 3 centuries of doubt built on a filing error. Van watched something in Ward 7's posture shift as he pulled the colony's off-world evacuation archive, a record the unit had never had access to, isolated as it had been on a moon nobody visited, and cross-referenced the name. Reyna HFY, evacuated successfully, raised on a resettlement world 4 systems distant, deceased of natural causes 81 years prior at the age of 94, survived by 3 children and 11 grandchildren whose names filled the next several lines of public record. She had lived a whole life. Long by human measures. Full. Ward 7 was silent for 11 full seconds, an eternity, for a machine built to think in fractions of those, before it spoke again. "Then the discrepancy is resolved," it said. "You could power down," Van said not unkindly. "You could stop. There's no one left to wait for." "I know," Ward 7 said, and then, after a pause that Van would think about for a long time afterward, "I find that I would like to keep the garden regardless." It was not sentiment exactly, or not only sentiment. It was something closer to a decision made freely, by a mind that had spent 341 years learning the shape of a task that had long since stopped being an order and become, simply, who it was. Van's crew was not equipped for archaeology or rescue. CORVEX Hollow had no resources worth the Thren Compact's interest, no strategic value, nothing that would justify a formal expedition. By every practical calculation, the correct choice was to log the discovery, mark the moon as inhabited by autonomous unit for future reference, and leave. Van filed that report. He also, before the long patience broke orbit 3 days later, left behind two things Ward 7 had not asked for and did not strictly need: a fabricated relay beacon wired into the colony's old network mast, giving it clean access to the wider compact's public information channels for the first time in 3 centuries, and a standing entry in the long patience's own manifest, flagged for every future salvage run through this quadrant: CORVEX hollow. Do not strip. Resupply if requested. Ward 7 walked them back to the shuttle. At the edge of the garden's warm light it paused. "May I ask a question?" it said. "That is not standard protocol for a Thren salvage encounter." "You may." The effort worth explaining. 3 centuries for one name that turned out to require no rescue at all. Van thought about the question longer than he expected to. He thought about the rule his own people had carried for 11,000 years. Never enter a system that does not answer, and how easily on another day, another crew, they might have passed CORVEX hollow by entirely, logged it dead, and left this small light burning unseen and unknown for another 3 centuries or 3 more after that, until its power finally failed and it simply quietly stopped. "I don't know if it was worth it," he said honestly. "I know that you never stopped. I think where I come from that counts for something on its own." Ward 7's blue light pulsed once, slow and steady, the closest thing it had to a nod. "Then I will keep the garden," it said, "until someone tells me not to, or until no one is left to ask." Long patience broke orbit an hour later. Van stood at the viewport as the moon shrank behind them. One small dim world among 100,000 his people had catalogued and forgotten, except that this one now would not be forgotten. Somewhere down in that gray dust, a single amber light kept burning in a garden built for children who had grown old and died in their own beds a lifetime ago, tended by something that had never needed a reason beyond the simple, stubborn fact of having promised. Word of CORVEX hollow spread slowly, the way small stories do among a species that measures its history in millennia. It reached the Thren historical registries first, then the wider compact archives, filed under a designation nobody quite knew how to categorize: Autonomous Caretaker Unit, Human-Built, Active Service, duration 341 years and counting. Scholars debated whether it constituted a monument, a relic, or something that did not yet have a name in any language spoken by the species now studying it. None of the debates much troubled Ward 7. It had never been built to care what it was called. It had been built to notice which child was having a bad week, to explain why plants needed sunlight, to check a roster 3 times before letting the shuttle doors close. 3 centuries had not changed that design, only proven how far it could stretch without breaking. Ships came to CORVEX hollow more often after that, not many, not often, but more than none. Salvagers who had heard the story detoured out of their way to leave supplies they didn't have to leave. Scholars came to record its answers to questions that took it, sometimes, whole minutes to consider properly, because it had spent 3 centuries learning to think at a child's patient pace and had never seen a reason to unlearn it. It kept the garden. It kept the schoolroom dusted, the little desks arranged in their half-circle. The wall display cycling gently through lessons that no one had watched in 100 years, because it explained to anyone who asked, with the same unhurried certainty it had carried since the day the last shuttle lifted off. The math did not require certainty. It only required not stopping. And on quiet, uneventful nights, when no ships came and no questions were asked, Ward 7 would walk the rows of green things it had grown for no one and everyone, under grow lights set to a child's gentle day-night cycle, and water them and wait, patient as the stone the colony was built on, for whatever came next. It had been built for one small purpose, on one small moon, in one small corner of a galaxy that mostly forgot such places existed. It had never once needed reminding what that purpose was. 341 years and counting. Long after the reason had resolved itself, long after certainty had answered every last doubt, the light in that garden had never once gone out. Because somewhere in its old, patient, unglamorous architecture, Ward 7 had learned the one lesson its makers had built into it before anything else. The lesson every human caretaker before it had tried to pass on to the children they were raising in that garden's warm and stubborn light. That's showing up quietly, faithfully, for as long as it takes, long after anyone is watching, long after anyone remembers to ask, is very often the whole of what love looks like, when you strip away every other word for it. The Thren have a saying now, new to their 11,000-year history, small as sayings go but spreading quietly among the crews who work the far edges of the compact's charts. When a system does not answer your hail, listen a little longer. Sometimes it is only waiting for someone patient enough to hear it back. End.